Hey, podcast listeners, we are back. It has been a while. I'm thrilled for what's ahead, but I just feel this urge to share everything that's happened in the last year. Every time I've approached this podcast and this episode, I keep recording and re-recording like this catch-up of everything that I've been up to. But that's not why you're here. For those of you who are interested in my journey, hopefully you'll be able to piece together that journey as we move forward. I'll leave it at this. It has been a wild ride in the last 12 to 24 months. Just completely nutty. And I'm still here. We've made it through, and I'm excited for what's ahead. Today, I have the first of a few episodes in a series that's a build in public style series with my good friend and often co-host Raj Lulla. We're pulling back the curtain on a book that he's written, that he's launching, on the writing process, on the marketing efforts, on all the hard work that goes into putting something meaningful out into the world with hope, with desire, with expectation. It's an act of courage. And my hope is that in sharing Raj's journey and our conversation around that it will inspire you to do similar work in your own life, to get unstuck if you feel stuck, to encourage you, inspire you to take the next step in whatever project you're dreaming up, that you're working on and pushing forward, whether that's a business, whether that's a creative project, whether that's something else. It doesn't matter. The act, the work is the same. Today we'll explore Raj's career and its major transitions, as well as the inspiration for his upcoming novel. Stick around to the end of the episode because we have a special offer that I've been dreaming up around his book and how you can be involved in this process. So let's dive in. Welcome to the Meaning Movement Podcast. This is a show about getting your work out there, overcoming obstacles, doing work that matters. Join us today with my friend Raj Lulla. Stay with us. Raj, welcome back for I don't even know how many times. You're the most frequent contributor to this show, and always a joy to have you on. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be the innumerable guest. I like that.
Yes, / co-host. The question I like to start with is, how do you begin to talk about the work that you do?
Yeah. You know, we talked the other day about how I was remembering that when I reached out to you, probably, I don't know, almost 10 years ago, 8 years ago, something like that, when you were writing the emails, as you always do, and at the end you say, reply to this, I read them all. And at that time, just because of the way the internet is, I assumed that you were getting 5,000 emails every time you write that, and you're just like shoveling through them, and just I'll get to you in 3 weeks when I dig out from this. But you had asked a question, something like, what do you want to do when you grow up? It wasn't exactly that, but it was, why are you here with the Meaning Movement? What are you trying to become? And I remember at that time writing something like, I want to start my own church. And as guests who've heard us talk before, or people who are listening have heard us talk about before, I spent the first 10 years of my career in ministry in the evangelical church, and that's not what I do now. And so even just kind of thinking about with you and our relationship, how that's evolved, my answer now would be considerably different. And so I guess to unpack that a little bit, grew up in a home. My dad is a practicing Hindu. My mom is a Christian, and she's from the Midwest, from the States, and my dad's Indian. And so my house was always kind of this interesting divide. My parents, have a great marriage. They've been married for a very, very long time. And, like 45 years, I think it is this year. And so that's never been a problem for them. But it's interesting being raised with two different worldviews, and it always seemed really subtle to me. In fact, it seemed much more Christian in our home than any of my dad's, religious influence. But it was always there, and for me, it always caused this kind of outsider feeling in the evangelical church, and I didn't realize it at the time. Couldn't have put my finger on it, especially not as a 8, 9, 10-year-old. when a lot of these experiences are really formative. But there was this sense to which I was always sort of trying to find the extreme of being in. And maybe that was a reaction to not always feeling in. Um,
Hmm.
and so when I would hear those sermons that were like, God wants you to do this with your life and all that, and I would feel so much like the pastors were talking directly to me, and did not really take any time to consider if I was a good fit for that, if anyone wanted me to do that, and other than just sort of the general, they want everyone to do that sort of thing,
Mm.
and so when I left that world about 8 years ago now, it was with a lot of identity confusion. And so even in the time of reaching out to you, I was still I was just still in the mode of thinking that being a creative professional, which is what I do now, was the detour. In fact, I remember having a conversation with God, being like, "Hey, if you want me to go back to ministry, you've got to stop blessing this." Like I did wedding photography first; it was working really well, and so I was like, "I really like this. Why would you do this to me?" Almost, like, why would you give me this thing that you're going to make me give up? And it turned out to be quite the opposite. That this was the path to back to, I think, what I was more originally meant to do. And
Hmm.
you know, I've talked I've talked before about how, when I was a kid, my dad wanted me to be a doctor. He's an Indian dad after all, but 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 beyond that though, he knew he could see things in me that were not going that direction. I remember we went to a it was kind of like an animation boot camp for kids. I don't remember, the school district put it on somehow. It was at the like educational service unit building, a very descriptive building, but they had all these Mac computers and this like studio program that we could animate this little dog and a fire hydrant and something, and it so that was always part of my life. And then, but I wasn't a very good visual artist. I'm not drawing that kind of stuff. But my dad would pay me to write. I didn't get any allowance for, doing chores or any of that kind of stuff. But he would pay me to write for him. And so in thinking of my life, I know the last time that we really talked about my career on the Meaning Movement, it was kind of all about how it sort of seemed like I was taking this detour from ministry, but now to me, it seems like ministry was the detour from creative work. So, in how I talk about my work, I would consider myself a creative professional. By day, I'm a brand strategist, a co-owner of Fruitful Design in Omaha, and then by hobby and by aspiring professional, I wrote a novel, and I have several more in the works. And the first
Hmm.
one's called The Caring House, that we are hoping to get out in the world together. That you've been very
Woo-hoo.
encouraging on helping me, pursue self-publishing with.
Love it. What a robust answer to that question. I appreciate all the context. I was like, man, I think that we just did the whole interview, but it's so great to have all that context. I want to double click on a couple things there. First is like, how do you think about what you're meant to do? You use the phrase, that the work that you were meant to do. That ministry wasn't that, and that you're maybe doing it or closer to doing it now. And I'm just curious how, I don't know, what those words mean to you.
Yeah, I definitely think differently about it now than I used to, and a lot of that has to do with, you know, I was committed to doing ministry, to doing nonprofit work for the rest of my life. I was 16 years old, and I literally chose the college I chose because they had promised to turn you into the kind of person who could spend 40, 50 years doing ministry. They put on a conference called In It for the Long Haul or something like that. And
Oof.
and that's
Yikes.
that's what I believed. It felt like, my version of joining the Marines or something. And
Mm.
it really called deeply to a sense of identity for me. What I discovered along the way, though, is that despite scoring really high on my standardized tests in high school, getting good grades, having jobs and multiple jobs all the way through high school and college, when I got out into the quote unquote real world, I had 7 jobs in ministry and nonprofit in my first 10 years of my career. A little bit of that was driven by the Great Recession, but most of it was driven by an ill fit. And and so I had a real crisis around this, sort of like, what am I meant to do?
Yeah.
And so in 2014, end of 2014, I I decided to take a bet on myself, and I had a small wedding photography business at that time that made up 25% of my revenue. And when I got laid off from my last job in nonprofit and ministry, I said, "Hey, I wonder if I spent all of my time, 100% of my time, could I turn 20%, 25% of my revenue into 100% of my revenue?" So I took
Mm.
that bet. We had our third kid on the way. We had 3 kids in 37 months in that period of time, and it was like, "Hey, if I can just bounce a baby on my knee for a few months, even off of creative work, if it just strings us along enough until I figure out the next thing, then that's a win."
Mm.
And and I just had a knack for it. I'm not the best photographer in the world. I know that. In fact, one of the things that I would tell people who are thinking about getting in creative business is that there are more talented people than you who work at Starbucks or other service jobs because they can't figure out the business side of it. And then
Yeah.
there are great people, or there are people who are great at the business side of it who are less talented than you, who are
Yeah.
succeeding.
Yeah.
And I had kind of the right combination of both. Enough talent to not embarrass myself, and enough business savvy to stay in the game.
Yes.
And if anything, that probably was the stronger suit of the two. I still love photography. I really, really enjoy it, but I also can look at other people's photos and go objectively, wow, they're really good.
Mm.
And so in terms of like what I was meant to do, that like I was talking about, that kind of faith crisis, identity crisis around what I'm quote unquote meant to do, I was feeling for the first time a natural fit. And it felt wrong because I had so convinced myself that I was supposed to do something else.
Mm.
And so now these days when I talk about what we were meant to do, I would talk more about what's a natural fit.
Yeah.
And I think we're often too precious about what that means, because
Yeah.
like if I would have been as precious about photography as I was about nonprofit work, then I would still be doing it, and my knees and back would be destroyed from shooting 40 weddings a year,
Mm.
and I wouldn't see my kids on the weekends because I'd always be at somebody else's wedding, and and so I really, it was about applying the skills that I learned in becoming a creative professional to now brand strategy and also to writing and releasing a novel.
Yes. I love it. I love it. So well said. Yeah, and I was just looking back at our email correspondence, which started in
Yeah.
2014, and kind of right before I think you went full time with creative work, and then after that, which is just wild. What a tumultuous season of life you were in then. But that's it feels like that's when people usually find me, and when they're in crisis.
Well, the funny thing is that I mean, depending on what month that was when I reached out, I either didn't know that I was going to be laid off that year or had
Yep.
just found out. And
Yeah. It's
it,
before.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah. And it reminds me of, so Brett Goldstein, who plays Roy Kent in Ted Lasso, he has a podcast called Films to be Buried with, and it's brilliant. It's funny. I am the twisted kind of person who wants to watch or listen to something from the beginning. So when I found out he had a podcast, I went all the way back to episode 1. The audio quality's terrible. He's not famous yet. All these things. He'd done a few movies and stuff, and he was an established stand-up, but he
Yeah.
wasn't Roy Kent at that time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
really fun to listen to him not know that he's about to have a monumental break in his career.
Yes.
It's just because he'll talk about like nobody coming to his shows and talking to empty rooms and all those things, and it's just like, just keep going, buddy. You'll be fine in about 30 episodes here.
I hope that you're drawing that parallel from his podcast to this one, right? And this is that moment when we don't know that it's about to blow up.
I certainly hope so. Yeah.
Or were you drawing the parallel to you didn't know that your life was about to blow up?
No, I mean, I think just the thoughts that I shared with you about what I thought I wanted to do with my life at that time
Yes.
seem naive now. And so it's just really interesting, having spent, those last 7-8 years as a creative professional, being really fulfilled, making also more money than I ever could have made there. Not that much, by the way, like not driving a Lambo or anything over here, but but still way better than I would have done a nonprofit, and have gotten more respect and more creative, exercise, all of those things. I didn't know that I was about to jump into that, and it took one more really painful disappointment. I flew 4,000 miles at the end of 2014 trying to find my next ministry gig, and it was in like a month or 2 months, and we had just moved back to Omaha where my parents live, and like I said, we had 3 kids in 37 months, and so it was like I was considering ripping my kids away from the grandparents to go follow that call, quote unquote, to go do this, when really the natural fit, what I was quote unquote meant to do, was sitting in my camera bag 5 feet from me when I was in the chair.
Yes. Wow. Well, I'm curious to. I always want to hear these moments where you transition. I think that's what this show is often, just because that's where my curiosity has centered on. So we've got the transition out of ministry into photography, and then let's just kind of connect the dots of like, how'd you get from there to here? What were some of the movements along there to get to Fruitful and what you do now?
Yeah. It happened almost instantaneously. My business partner, Ben Luders, who's the other owner here at Fruitful, he was the freelance graphic designer I hired at my last nonprofit job. And he would make these comments about how I wish I had one of you for every one of my projects. And I didn't really understand what that meant, because I'm not a particularly like organized person. So I was like, I don't think you mean me as a project manager. And I mean, like, I'm disciplined, but I'm not highly like organized and detailed. I love having an executive assistant. It's been life-changing for me. And so I didn't really understand what his comment meant. I wish I had one of you for all of my clients. But then what I came to discover was that people would come to graphic designers and say, hey, will you build me a website? Graphic designers would say, absolutely. And then they would kind of look at each other and the client says, what should we put on it? And a designer says, oh, well, I mean, what I do is I take the things that you give me and I make them look good. And so many clients are missing that step between what they need and it being ready to put out in the world. And I forever, for whatever reason, probably because my dad paid me, a quarter a page or $1 a page or whatever it was, to write recaps of the Chicago Bulls games in the 90s for him, that I had an ability to quickly come up with words. And so when Ben would send me back a brochure that I had asked him to design for the college I was working at, and say, hey, I need a paragraph right here, or this headline is 12 words, I need it to be 6. It was it was nothing to me. I won an award in high school for advertising design, and again thought it was just the aberration. Like, just I'm more of a youth group kid. I could care less about this journalism contest. And even thinking back now, I was the guy on staff that our chief editors, Michael and Crystal of our high school newspaper, would go to when they're like, we got to cut this headline down. Somebody turned in a headline that's 10 words. I need it to be 8. What can you do for me? Or even if a piece was all the way written but needed a headline,
Yeah.
just the ability to switch around words and mash them together, all that has always just come super easy to me. And I didn't think there was any money in it. Like it just seemed like, and I will say too, part of that is when we graduated high school 20 years ago, little over 20 years ago now, people were saying don't go into journalism because all the newspapers were dying. They were being eaten by free internet content, all of that. Now, of course, I'm furiously angry at that advice because the world is driven by content now. But if I had done anything besides go to Bible college right after high school, definitely it would have been going into writing. It would have been either journalism or just a plain English major. That was clear to me, but everybody in my life at the time was advising me not to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to ask you, like, are words the thing?
Are words the thing? Yeah, I think so. Now I struggle for words to describe why. But yeah, with Ben, so immediately after I switched to photography full time, the funny thing is I don't know that I actually ever did photography full time because months after I made that switch, I was approached by some churches here locally who wanted me to be their communications director. And I'm not a designer. And a lot of times a communications director at a church they're looking for a unicorn, somebody who's great at graphic design, good at web, good at SEO, good at social, good at video, good at writing, all sorts of things. They're looking for 6 staff positions for the price of less than 1. And so again, this is like the just bare knuckled survival instinct. I went to the church and I was like, I do not want another nonprofit job, but I want to do this work for you because I'm good at it. And I had just spent time managing. I don't remember what my budget was to the college, but I think it was like a $500,000 budget. I was 29 managing a $500,000 budget or something like that. And and I was like, I can do this, but I absolutely did not want to work for them. I had my own business. And so I said, if you pay me half and pay my designer, Ben, half, then we will do this work for you together. You got to figure out video on your own. And after a little time, they accepted this idea. We worked together for several years. That was our first client together. And so I became a brand strategist about 3 months after I became a professional. After I became a quote unquote full-time photographer. This was all about 4 years after I'd become a professional photographer. And so in terms of are words the thing, that's always what I've brought. But I would say words are the thing in the sense that writing is discipline of thought. When you really boil it down to what writing is, what makes something good versus something bad. There's this Aaron Sorkin show, Studio 60 on Sunset Strip. It only lasted for 1 season. I'm a huge fan of it. Lindsay and I watch it every Christmas because I love their holiday episode in that show. But there's a scene where the people are trying to write a sketch and they are absolutely sucking. They're just terrible at it. And so then their mentor says, okay, what's funny about this situation? And they tell him. And he goes, okay, now go back to it and take away everything that isn't that. That's how you get to good writing.
Yeah.
It's taking away. I've heard a similar story about Michelangelo carving David, where somebody asked him, like, how did you carve this amazing statue? And he said a very, very similar thing. He said, I took the slab of marble and I knocked away anything that wasn't David. And writing all creation, I think, is really about editing as much as it is about creating. It's about taking away what's not core, what's not central to the idea. And so many people struggle with that in such a noisy world. And for whatever reason, my brain just is able to drill down to those central ideas and then thankfully have enough vocabulary and letters of the alphabet to put it together into coherent words.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, that's very well said. So it sounds like that was kind of the impetus or the start of Fruitful. You and Ben working at doing the communications for that church, and it's grown since then. But let's now connect the dots from there to where is it now and what's next as you look forward and into your career and into the future.
Yeah. Yeah. Ben had already built, or he started Fruitful the same year that I hired him as a freelancer. So we've been working together from the beginning. Me first on the client side, now as his partner in business, and yeah, those years we have basically 10x the revenue from that time where it was just barely enough to pay for Ben's own family to being an over $1 million business a year now. Which, by the way, for anybody who's entering the creative world is not as amazing as it sounds. Don't get me wrong. There are really, really wonderful things about it. I'm sitting in a very nice podcast studio that kind of revenue has afforded, but it's not what it sounds like. Just because it's $1 million business does not mean I am personally a millionaire. And that's something that I've learned about creative business is that it's a team sport. And so in order to do it really, really well, you need to have the right people around you. You have to watch your numbers really well, all of those things. But yeah, what we do now is we do branding, messaging, and websites for often service-based businesses, typically B2B businesses or B2C businesses that are trying to do something more in the world. We don't have the nonprofit bent anymore, although we certainly serve probably 20 or 30% of our customers every year are nonprofits, and they're really, really wonderful. We love working with them. But we work often really well with people who are going through an identity crisis of sorts. Again, writing is discipline of thought. And so it looks like, a parent handing down a business after, 20, 30, 40 years to a child who's taking over. By child, I mean, descendant, not actual child, but, probably somebody who's mid-career, who's, 40 or so themselves. And they're taking on the accounting firm or the medical practice or whatever business it is, and but now the son or daughter has some ideas of what it's going to take to survive and thrive into the next generation. So I help rename businesses. That's one of the most disciplined thinking about words is is what do I call this? It's like naming a child. And so naming businesses, branding them, getting new messaging on their websites. We're a story brand certified agency, so we use story, we use writing in our messaging for people because it's how humans make sense of the universe, and therefore it helps people understand if they should buy your product as well. And so yeah, we are continuing to serve places like that. We also do really, really well with internal pieces of larger businesses. So, we just got done doing an R&D with the largest privately owned bank in the country, and it's really, really hard to talk about things like blockchain inside a large organization when everybody else is like, don't put that crypto stuff in here because it's dangerous, and there's good reason for them to say things like that. But at the same time, they have to be able to engage with technologies that could disrupt them. And so we just got done helping them communicate and brand and message their way through some incredibly innovative initiatives over there. And so we work with internal parts of companies as well on things like R&D, wellness, employment, hiring, those types of things.
Love it. Well, and you didn't mention, but like the pinnacle of your success, which is the new Meaning Movement website, which will be live whenever this episode is live. So, I'm a very, very happy client getting to enjoy the beautiful work that you and the team do.
I mean, that is such the pinnacle of our success that I did not even have to mention it. I assume that people just know.
Well, the reason I was like, well, I need to mention that and connect the dots for listeners, but then also you said identity crisis, and like my whole life is an identity crisis. So of course you would be the agency that I would want to work with, because my career is nothing but if it's not an identity crisis.
We're just going to rename this podcast to the Identity Crisis Podcast.
That might have been a better name for it, really.
I'm thinking about it. It's like, that's actually pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so welcome to the Identity Crisis Podcast. I'm your host, Dan, who's always in an identity crisis. So talk to me a little bit about the next phase. So you're doing you're playing with words. Playing with words, it's probably not the right way to say it, but
I'll take it.
you get
It's
to
fine.
do things with words professionally.
Yeah.
And then you're also doing things with words on the side. And I think I want to, kind of connect the dots. What kind of spoke to me is you're talking about that taking away process
Yeah.
of words. I kind of I want to do that with your career a little bit. And
Yeah.
like, as you're thinking about what's next and like taking the things away. And I think that goes back to my question of like, are words the thing for you? But talk to me about the books.
Yeah. So I did this really brilliant thing in at the beginning of 2016. I had who's probably 9 months old at that time. 9 month old at that time. Our middle would have been just over 2, and our oldest would have been probably just had turned 4 or about to turn 4. And so I decided, what, this would be a great time in the middle of building a business for the first time. I should go ahead and start trying to write the great American novel because I'm really, really smart like that. No, truthfully, the space that running a creative business had given me in my head of not trying to figure out, for one, how I was going to provide for my family on a nonprofit salary, and then for the other, not also just having margin, because I knew how to create some efficiencies in the creative business where I wasn't working all the time. I wasn't working 50, 60 hours a week. I don't know that I was working 40 when I at that time. And it gave me enough space that I realized that, you know, and this is something all creative people I think should realize, is that often what pays the bills is when you rent out your skills to other people. And
Mm.
so photography, I wasn't out there shooting fine art photography hoping that people would buy my prints. And that is a valid way of making money in the industry, but it's not the way most people are going to make money in the industry.
Yeah.
And so photography, I was renting out my skills to brides and grooms who were who needed well composed, well lit, well edited photos to capture the most important day of their lives. And I was happy to do so. It was really wonderful. It was kind of like living in a rom-com every weekend. I got to enter so many people's stories as such a small part of it, but in such a close and personal way. It was an honor. But I was renting out my skills. And same with writing words for other people for a living. You probably only get so many words in your lifetime,
Mm.
just by virtue of of the nature of life. And you're going to have so many words that you say, so many words that you write. And I found a way to make money renting mine to other people, but I had never, since high school, I hadn't written much for myself other than blogging, which was fun and frivolous, but it was just a practice of writing, really. So at the beginning of 2016, I heard this episode of This American Life that was about a grief counseling center for children in Salt Lake City. My wife Lindsay and I had lived in Salt Lake City for a year, and so I could just picture this place. I knew what neighborhood it was in, and also the culture of Salt Lake City, which has this, just south of Salt Lake, there's Utah County. They call this place Happy Valley, and it's kind of a sarcastic thing because it's got the highest use of antidepressant usage in the country, and so everybody looks happy, but it's medically induced, which is totally great if you need it. I'm all for psychiatric medicines when you need them. They've been beneficial for me. But the point though was like I could just really understand this place, and I heard this story, grief counseling for children in Salt Lake, and they, unfortunately, a lot of the kids had lost a parent to suicide, and I think about 60% of the kids who are there have lost a parent to suicide, typically a dad. And I might be wrong on the exact figure, but a high percentage. And there was just this wild hair that went off in my brain of, I wonder if a boy and a girl who had met there, both having lost a dad in the same way, if they could fall in love and get married and then survive life, with the kind of ever gnawing suspicion that maybe one or the other would be lost in the same way they lost their dads.
Hmm.
And it was a really great what if that, great and terrible, of course, what if, but that got my brain churning. And I honestly don't remember if it was a couple of hours, a couple of days, but I mean, within a very short amount of time, I went back to my home office. It was like this little nook of our bedroom in this townhouse we were renting, and I typed the first line of the book. And I was writers talk about this stuff. I hate it because I wish it wasn't true of my story, but I heard this voice in my head, and I just started digging out what the conversation was that started this one particular phrase, this one particular line. And so for me, it felt more like an uncovering process than a creating process. I was It's like I knew that because of like just hope that I had in the universe, that I wasn't writing a tragedy. I'll spoil that part of the book for everyone. But I knew that I wasn't writing some indie Hollywood thing that makes us navel gaze and go, gosh, isn't life bleak sometimes? I knew that I wasn't writing that story. But I started with a crisis, and I knew where I needed to end. And then it just felt like discovering everything in the middle. And it was fun. Like it was a lot of work, but it almost felt like moving these folks out of my head every time I would write. It was just like it was like they would get louder and louder and louder until I was like, fine, I will write, and I will sit down. And we lived across it wasn't even across the street from a Starbucks. It was across a field from a Starbucks. And so, sometimes when the babies were down for naps, I would just sneak over there. And I have this kind of peculiar writing habit. I don't know if anybody else has this, but I would play the same song on repeat until it just became noise in my brain. And then I would just write these characters until they were quiet enough for me to go about my day again. If you've ever seen the movie The Man Who Invented Christmas, about Charles Dickens writing the Christmas Carol, very similar to that. Like the ghost actually kind of visiting and messing with him. It felt similar to that. And I loved it. I hadn't written fiction since high school. I honestly didn't know if I was writing a screenplay or a novel or if I was just wasting my time. It just felt like therapy, kind of just getting these things out of my head. And so I just followed it as far as it went, and 86,000 words later, it's a book.
And what's the we're gonna dig in more in future episodes to like really the why of this book and your hope for the book, but just to focus on you as Raj the writer, the author, like what's your ambition when it comes to writing a book like this and other books? I know you have other works in the hopper, and I think I guess what I'm trying to get at is like there's these parts of your career, and I love that you're talking about renting your time versus renting out your skills rather versus making your money from the product of your skills, I guess. And is this potentially, like, if you could wave a magic wand and have all your dreams come true, would eventually Raj Lulla the writer be the main thing, or is it some blend, or is it something else? It's a lot of questions in there. Choose your own adventure.
Um, I absolutely know the answer to this question, and it's also the scariest thing to say out loud, which is yes. That is what I would love. In fact, Ben and I have talked about, if the book blows up and there's a world where I need to go spend 3 months in LA to help Netflix turn it into a movie, I'm going to do it. Like he already knows that it's like, you got to sit somebody in my seat who can write well enough on websites for 3 months while I go do this, because there's no chance that I'm not doing that. And but the reason it's scary to say out loud is in part because it's always been scary. When I started writing the book, I was probably, 14 months or so off of my last nonprofit job. I thought this was a detour from nonprofit and faith work, and I really struggled with the fact that the book is not a Christian book. It's not an anti-Christian book, but it's not a Christian book either. There's no scene where somebody goes into a chapel and, prays to accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior, and then it somehow works out their problem and their family's whole again and whatever. Like that's not this book. And there's bad
Mm.
words in it too. And so I struggled at the time thinking that I was going to be probably going back into faith-based nonprofit work again and wondering, like, this book feels like authentically my work for the first time in my life, and it really doesn't fit this industry. And so that caused a lot of identity crisis around, do I fit this industry?
Mm.
And 7 years later, we've answered the question. The answer is no. But that was really, really hard. It was 30 plus years of programming in my life at that time, of conviction in my life at that time,
Yeah.
that was what I was supposed to do. And in the matter of 14 months, it like decomposed, it deconstructed. And so it's scary to say out loud that, yes, this is what I've always wanted, that I've always wanted to be a writer. And
Yeah.
but I was fortunate to have a great conversation with Donald Miller, who's a New York Times bestseller for several books, and he described me as the writer who struggles at the core with the question of whether or not life is worth living. And that is why I write. That's what The Caring House is about, my first book. That is what the other books that I'm working on are about, though in different ways. They're not all, death and and grief and all those things. The first book is in large part because of the things that I was going through at the time, and we'll talk about that in the next episode. But the other books, though, all deal with kind of this question of, like, how is anyone okay
Yes.
with this existence? I love how John Green, who wrote The Fault in Our Stars, talks about, like, it's weird that we have bodies, that we have bacteria in our gut that either makes us depressed or anxious or happy, and we have zero control over that, and much of it is determined from the moment we're born. And so it's like, are we even who we really are? Or is it a lot of microbes telling us who we are? And I've been listening to some Pete Holmes lately, and he had a great conversation with Stephen Pressfield, who wrote The War of Art. And in that, Pete said that art is highly sensitive people reporting back to everyone else how they experience reality. And so I think that, The Caring House is it's such a great quote. It's like
So
a
good.
comedian who tells a lot of jokes about his anatomy. It was really profound thought. He's a deep thinker. I'm really enjoying his work. But
Yes, I love his stuff. It's so good.
but that idea, that's really what formed the first book, and what's going to form all the books is that if you allow yourself to be sensitively open to the fact that life is this crazy mix of beauty and joy and pain, then there's this tension of existence that comes from that. And we have to decide whether it's worth continuing to press on into this, knowing that it's going to have both the good and the bad, or if we're going to give up. And ultimately, again, I don't know if it's my gut bacteria or whatever that tells me this, but I believe that life really is worth living. And I also acknowledge the dark shadow strokes that are painted into this whole thing. And some people would, I think, a bit too tritely say, well, that's what makes the light parts shine. I would say probably for me it's a little bit more that there's beauty in the combination of the dark and the light strokes, even if we would not choose to have any of those dark strokes.
I just want to, I just feel like I just need to let that sit for a second. because it's true. It's just so true, and so true of my experience, and so true of my life, that like so much of the goodness that has come through pain that I would never have chosen. And so thank you for carrying that torch, carrying that message, for believing in that truth. It matters.
Thanks for
Uh,
giving me a space to say it, and you've been so supportive of this journey as well. I know people have heard me on the podcast a handful of times in the last year, but what they don't see is we might be at over 100 conversations now. We probably are well over 100 conversations now, and some of them for you, some of them for me, but your constant encouragement that I shouldn't wait to put this work out in the world. I shouldn't necessarily be precious about whether it's with a traditional publisher or self-published, has really encouraged me, and it's changed my thinking about what the value of this is and what the purpose of it is. So I thank you for that.
Yeah, I'm moved by that, and like you said earlier, like this is what you've always wanted, and I applaud the bravery of even saying those words, and how much harder this is because of that. If you didn't care about this book, if you didn't care about where this journey took you, then it would be a non-issue. But because it matters, it's so much scarier, because it might not take you where you want it to go, and therefore like it's easier to not do it, because then you don't have to face the potential of being disappointed by the outcome. But you have to face that in order to take that risk and find out if this could take you there, which is one of the ironies, I guess, of creative work, and it's not just creative work, it's of doing work that matters. It's why I have these conversations, right? Because this is what it's about, is like the risk and the journey and the figuring it out as we go. And so I'm just stoked for your to witness your bravery in this process, and thank you for leading by example.
Well, thank you. All of us really don't know what the effect of our work will be in the world. I mean, F. Scott Fitzgerald was very nearly a forgotten writer, and it happened to be that World War II, it was the combination of World War II and him having a warehouse of unsold copies of The Great Gatsby that rocketed him to to the pantheon of American writers. And now, don't get me wrong, very, very talented person, but were it not for those things, The Great Gatsby would not have become what it did.
100%.
And but even sitting here thinking, it's not just creators, like you said. I mean, like sitting here talking to a microphone to you, I don't know who invented the microphone, and could they have imagined podcasting? Could they have imagined, the tiny, tiny microphones in our cell phones that record birthday parties and, engagements and last words and all these, incredible moments in life? And, this was probably some guy in a laboratory with a workbench and a soldering iron going, I wonder if I can replicate the human voice with some, metal and some wires. That's pretty stinking amazing. And everybody's work and life are like that. We don't actually know what the effect of them are going to be until we put it out in the world. And that's scary. It's so hard. I wish, I wish that we had a sense of the future and what the work was going to be before we put it out, and then get to decide whether or not it's worth doing. But we don't. So we just have to do the things that we're quote unquote meant to do, the things that come natural, and hope that it fits into the tapestry of humanity in a way that's useful and helpful.
Beautifully said. Let's call it a wrap there. We have no more conversation to have about this book in particular and about your journey ahead, but I'm excited to see how it unfolds. Excited to see you continue to hold that tension of renting out your skills and also wanting to be paid for the other words that you write, your own words, I guess you could say. But thank you for this conversation. Thank you, just your willingness to be so open about where you are and where you want to go.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you so much, Raj, and thank you, dear listeners. You can find links to Raj's newsletter, his book, a place you can pre-order it in our show notes at themeaningmovement.com/Raj book launch. That's RAJ book launch. I've been thinking about pondering how we can come together as a community and support Raj and his efforts and create some synergy between what he's doing and what we're doing. And I've put together this plan. First and foremost, just again, all of the royalties from this pre-launch go to a fantastic charity. So that anything that I do, that we do, only just helps kids who need some extra support, who've been through traumatic experiences. So my idea is that we put together a book club for this book. If we sell 50 copies, if the Meaning Movement community can buy 50 copies of this book, whether you buy 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 yourself, or maybe 50 people all buy one, I'm not too concerned about it, but I would love to see us buy 50 of his, pre-order 50 of his books. And then I will lead us in a book study through, book club is a better way to say it, through the book. Raj will make an appearance and do some Q&A. We'll do it over a few sessions. It'll be a blast and a chance for us to meet each other, hang out more, bring the community together. So grab a book from the link in the show notes, and then email the receipt to book@rajlulla.com with your receipt. And in that email, just mention the Meaning Movement. That's how Raj tracks the pre-orders, make sure that those royalties get sent along. So you buy the book, send the receipt to book@rajlulla.com. Let's aim for 50 sales or more. In a couple of weeks, we'll be back discussing the launch and marketing strategies and putting this kind of work out into the world. I hope this is inspiring for you. If you have any thoughts, any feedback, shoot me an email at podcast@themeaningmovement.com. Thank you so much for listening, for being a part of this crazy thing. We'll be back with you shortly.